Hi students, this is my lecture video about photosynthesis. Before you watch this video, make sure that you have completed the photosynthesis study guide because that's the general overview, and this is going to be the details about photosynthesis like the cellular respiration one was. On that note, I do want you to, in your notes, make this diagram and follow along with me and do the same thing like you did last time. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is write down the photosynthesis equation. So you have to have carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. It's not, sometimes it's written before the arrow, sometimes it's written on top of the arrow. It's not technically a reactant, but it has this equation, or this reaction has to happen in the presence of sunlight. So this is the most accurate way to do it. But you'll see it before the arrow too. It's okay. And then the products are glucose and oxygen. Okay, so this is a chloroplast. Just like the mitochondria, it has an outer membrane. Unlike a mitochondria, it doesn't have one large inner membrane that's just folded up. It has several little pancake-looking things. So you might have seen them like this inside of a chloroplast. These are called thylakoids. So this is an individual thylakoid. This whole thing, a stack of thylakoids, is called a granum. More than one stack would be called grana, if it's more than one. So these are made out of membranes. They're little membrane discs or pancakes. Sometimes we call them that. Each pancake or disc is called a thylakoid. So it's just a membrane. Okay. Also, I have a dotted line drawn here. This is just to represent what happens in sunlight or requires sunlight, or what is called our light dependent reactions, meaning they can only occur in sunlight. So basically at night, these processes aren't happening. And then this process, which we'll get to in a second, this reaction can happen without sunlight. So this is the light independent reaction. Or reactions, because technically it's more than one. Okay, now, a chloroplast isn't divided in half. There's granum all over the place, and the light-dependent reactions happen inside the thylakoids, or the stacks of thylakoids called granum. The light-independent reactions happen in what's called the stroma, which is just like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. It's like the liquidy stuff inside the chloroplast. And obviously that can happen anywhere. Anywhere there's not granum, there's stroma, kind of like the matrix on the inside of a mitochondria. So this process happens anywhere in the stroma, and these processes happen anywhere in thylakoids, okay? All right, so first step of photosynthesis is light hitting these little photosystems is what they're called. They're protein things that have chlorophyll in them, so that's why I'm doing it in green. Chlorophyll is the pigment that, when light hits it, helps the chloroplast capture that energy. And how it captures that energy, which here I'll put light energy, which is what sunlight is, it's light energy. So what it does is it energizes the electrons of that chlorophyll, making them hop off or excited. And when they do that, they hop to the next thing in this chain. Now, hopefully you're recognizing this little box It's very similar to the boxes that you saw on your mitochondria. It is a proton pump, just like the three that were next to the ATP synthase in the mitochondria. It's a proton pump, and so proton pumps pump protons. So there are, just like in a mitochondria, there's protons around, and this pumps protons into the thylakoid membranes, into high concentration. So from low concentration out here to high concentration here. And because we're pumping protons against the concentration gradient from low to high concentration, that requires energy. And so the energy again is electrons, just like it was in the proton or the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. So this electron powers this pump. And then we have to end this one. There's two photosystems. They energizes again the same way, get electrons, and it pops over here. Now this one's not black because technically it's different. It's not a proton pump. Basically, it's like a little dock. Electrons sit here and wait to be picked up by something, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So if we have a high concentration of protons inside of our thylakoids, which there would be one here too. Okay. This is also a proton pump. These are just two thylakoids where the same reaction's happening. So if we're pumping protons from low to high concentration, protons don't want to stay in high concentration. Hopefully you're recognizing this molecule here as ATP synthase. And just like in the mitochondria, ATP synthase's job is to make ATP. All right, so when these protons flow through the ATP synthase from high concentration inside the thylakoids to low concentration outside the thylakoids, they make ATP by spinning. And when ATP synthase spins, it forces together an ADP molecule and a phosphate group, just like in cellular respiration. Okay, so this whole process, light energizes the chlorophyll, making electrons energized or excited to hop to this proton pump and power it, to pump protons from low concentration to high concentration. And then the same thing happens here. We energize the chlorophyll electrons, and they hop over here to this docking station where they're waiting for something to pick them up. And then also inside the thylakoid, we have high concentration of protons flowing from a high to low concentration, passive transport, facilitated diffusion through the ATP synthase, which spins, and when it's spinning, puts together ADP and phosphate to make ATP molecules. Okay, this all has to happen in the presence of sunlight, because if there's no light hitting this, then there's no electrons being energized, and this basically stops. So at night, this doesn't happen. When there's no sunlight, this doesn't happen. Okay, next part. Something has to pick up, wait, hold on, I almost forgot. So we need water. You have to water your plants. The only reason you have to water your plants is so that, in this case here, H2O comes in, the water you give your plants, comes in, and these electrons, eventually, if chlorophyll's being hit by sunlight, losing electrons, we have to replace those electrons. What replaces those electrons is water being split. When water gets split, it gets split into oxygen, which is our waste product in photosynthesis. Plants produce oxygen. This is where it comes from. You water your plants, oxygen or water gets split into two oxygens and electrons. Just like before, when in cellular respiration, when oxygen was picking up electrons, it was forming water. Well, now water is being split. Basically, we're undoing what happened in cellular respiration. We're splitting that water into oxygen and electrons, which replace these electrons. So there's always electrons to be energized by the sunlight. So the only reason you water your plants is for electrons. So they have electrons to keep doing this process with. Okay. Now, once the electrons get here on this little transport chain, it's not exactly like the electron transport chain in cellular respiration, but it's very close, okay? They end up here and they have to go somewhere. We need them over here, so there's a molecule called NADP plus or NADPH. Now, hopefully you're seeing NAD and it's ringing a bell because it's very similar to the molecule NAD in cellular respiration, which carries electrons. So NADP is the electron carrier in photosynthesis. So these electrons get picked up by NADP and taken over here because we need electrons in this cycle over here. This cycle is called the Calvin cycle because the guy who discovered it is named Calvin, I believe. Sometimes it's also called the citric acid cycle, but we're going to use the term Calvin cycle. They are the same thing if you see them though. Okay, so we need electrons in this cycle. The other thing we also need, if we're trying to make glucose, which is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens. So we get our electrons, which is going to form the bonds between our carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. This is where we need CO2. The reason that plants inhale, they don't have lungs, but the reason they breathe in CO2 is for this. This is the carbon and the oxygen they need to make part of glucose. So unlike Krebs, where everything was being broken apart, we're putting things in and we're going to make something, okay? So we need electrons, we need carbon and oxygen. We also need hydrogen right here. This comes from the hydrogen protons that are just floating around all over the place inside of a chloroplast. Just like there's hydrogen protons over here, some of them wind up getting snatched and put into this. You'll just have to trust that there's just hydrogen everywhere, okay? So electrons, CO2, and hydrogen. Now, to force all these molecules together to make our end product, which is eventually going to be glucose, it also takes some energy. So this ATP that was made over here is also required over here. So what goes into the Calvin cycle is electrons carried by NADP and ATP produced by the thylakoids, that process over there. Carbon dioxide, which comes from the atmosphere. And hydrogen protons. All these things go in, and what comes out are 2 3-carbon molecules. They're not pyruvate molecules. They're called something else. They're called G3P. You don't have to know that. Just remember that they're basically 2 half glucoses. And then those 2 half glucose molecules or 2 3-carbon molecules leave the chloroplast, just like glycolysis happens outside in the cytoplasm. Putting glucose together, the final step happens outside over here. And eventually you get put together, you get your glucose molecules. So that happens out in the cytoplasm. Just like glycolysis, the opposite, breaking glucose, happens outside in the cytoplasm. So this is basically backwards cellular respiration. And if you look at it, the equations are exactly opposite of one another. The products of cellular respiration are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, water, and a different kind of energy. You need sunlight instead of making ATP. But then the products of photosynthesis are glucose and oxygen. The reactants, what you start with in cellular respiration, is glucose and oxygen. So if you flip this equation, it's cellular respiration. Just like if we were to explain this backwards, it would almost be exactly cellular respiration. The same thing's happening, basically, it's backwards. I hope this made sense. If you have questions, you can join the Zoom tutorial or email me anytime. Have a great day.